Good morning. Welcome to the Land Bank Authority in Georgia webinar sponsored by the Georgia Initiative for Community Housing Program. My name is Karen Tinsley. I'm the program coordinator for the GIC program, and I'm at the University of Georgia College of Family Consumer Sciences. So first I just want to thank our hosts here, Georgia Municipal Association, and also recognize our other partners and sponsors of the GIC program. Georgia Department of Community Affairs and our founding sponsor, the Georgia Power Company. Just to let you know, we're convening this webinar at the request of several GIC communities. So just for your information, please keep us informed of other special topics that you might want to hear about, and that's for participating and alumni cities. This webinar will be recorded and will be available later for other participants that may not have been able to participate today. And before I turn it over, I just want to thank our presenters in advance, Chris Norman, Allison Sother Goldie, and Norman Michael. And you received a copy of their bios yesterday. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Corey with Georgia Municipal Association to talk about logistics of participating in the webinar.
Thank you, Karen. We will be taking questions and trying to answer those as we go through the presentation. You'll be able to ask those questions in the control panel on the right. There's a dialog box called questions, and if you will, please type your questions there, and we will try to answer those as we go through the presentation or at the end, depending on the question that's asked. We do have you muted so that we don't experience audio feedback issues, so please type your questions if you will. At this time, I'll turn it over to Chris to begin the presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Corey. As Corey mentioned, I am Chris Norman. I serve as the president of the Georgia Association of Land Bank Authorities, and thrilled that so many folks around Georgia are interested in this topic and are joining us today to learn a little bit more about land banking authorities in the state of Georgia, as well as a potential for creating more land bank authorities. We are joined today with two of my colleagues from the state. Allison Goldie, she's the executive director of the Macon-Bibb Land Bank Authority and can provide a little bit more detail when she is introduced. And Norman Michael, who serves as the secretary treasurer of the Georgia Association of Land Bank Authorities, and he is the executive director in Augusta. He's experiencing some technical difficulties, so he may join us later in the call. So having said that, I want to kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. So you'll see on your screen the presentation that we are going to walk you through, and the copy of this will be provided to you after the presentation. So this provides kind of the outline. So we're going to walk you through just an overview of land banks. You know, what are they? Where are they? How many are they? That type of stuff. How do you determine if you need a land bank? I'll give you some detail information on the Land Bank Act that was recently passed and what goes along with that. Then kind of segue into how do you start or restart a land bank authority in your community. And then we're also going to talk about special considerations for small rural communities, as well as emphasis on things you should be aware of as you do development activity, and then talk a little bit about education and coalition building for new land banks in your community, and then we'll open it up generally for questions. So having said that, I'm going to move right into my portion, which is the overview portion. So what is a land bank? A lot of folks aren't sure what they are, but you know, a land bank is a public or nonprofit entity that's created by the state statute. As referenced before, there's a statute passed in 2012, the Georgia Land Bank Act, which I will give more detail on later. It allows you to create land banks. And these land banks are created through local intergovernmental agencies, intergovernmental agreements, which basically are agreements between your local city and your local county for how you would operate. So they are a tool. They are not a cure-all. They are a tool in your property development and delivery system that takes and converts this vacant, abandoned, distressed property that we all have throughout all of our communities and tries to turn it into something productive. And typically productive will mean a tax-generating piece of property, or it could be something for the public benefit, such as a park, a public building, things of that nature. And so we're not just relegated to residential, but you can also deal with residential, commercial, industrial, and green space properties. And the core competency of the land bank is really how do you acquire and dispose of this category of property in our respective communities. Now, we do like to emphasize that we do not have eminent domain authority, and we're not a taxing authority. That resides with your local government. And land banks typically step in where the market is not functioning properly, or the work cannot be done due to other types of overlaying administrative or legal barriers that make it difficult to do development projects in your respective community. The history of land banks. When did they start? So you can see by this chart here, the table, they have been around for quite some time. 1971 was the first, and they have evolved over the years as we've learned more about the utility of land banks and the possibility for different types of programs. And you can see St. Louis was first. Atlanta was actually the fourth created in the country. Since then, we've experienced quite a bit of growth during the 2000s, and we now have over 150 land banks throughout the United States. The last bit of legislation occurring in New York and Pennsylvania that has generated quite a few. In terms of the existence of land banks in the state of Georgia, you'll see that actually these are some of the land banks. There are actually a few more that we are confirming right now that have been created recently, but you'll see that land banks are in areas as large as Fulton County down to smaller counties such as Thomas County. And so there is no formula for a minimum or maximum population size for a land bank. As you can see by the chart, they are quite common throughout the state of Georgia, and we're actually the third highest density in the nation in terms of having land banks. As mentioned before, we focus on all categories of property, and particularly these classes of property here, your surplus public inventory, how do you dispose of that? Foreclosed properties that are, in transit, sit around for years, abandoned properties that sit there, and tax delinquent properties. Land banks can really get into those properties and try to move them forward. So one of the common questions is, well, how do we know if we want a land bank authority, or is there a need for a land bank authority? So things to consider. Do you have a lot of inventory that's fragmented and scattered throughout your respective city, which makes it difficult for development to occur? Do you have large inventories that are vacant and abandoned? And have you experienced a scenario where the market value has continued to spiral down, and in essence creating dead zones within your respective community? Land banks can deal with that class of property. Do you have ineffective tax foreclosure procedures that make it difficult to convert delinquent properties that are delinquent, have delinquent taxes, into something that is productive, or move it into the hands of an owner that will be able to do something with that property that benefits their overall community situation? Do you have an issue with code violations that are fairly rampant through your community? That is something to examine. It doesn't necessarily mean you will need a land bank, but that is something to examine. Are there a lot of title issues? And then, do you have issues with disposing of property that's owned by the respective municipality just due to constraints brought on either by your city, your charters, or other legal frameworks that make it difficult to dispose of properties in your community? So, having recognized the utility of land banks, we saw that there was a need to tweak the legislation in the state of Georgia. And in order to help move that forward, we created the Georgia Association of Land Bank Authorities in August of 2011. I have the pleasure of serving as president since that time. And really the purpose of GALBA, as we affectionately call it, is really to promote and discuss this whole issue of land bank authorities throughout the state, such as this webinar. So this is, the mission of GALBA playing out as we see it, is really to help foster the sharing of this information amongst land bank authorities, not only in Georgia, but throughout the nation. We are in correspondence with land banks all over the country in terms of all of us are trying to tweak and improve how we operate. And then also to provide technical assistance as land banks come into life throughout the state of Georgia. We want to have an entity that could assist them with that. So you have GALBA that exists. And so GALBA came together. We worked with the state legislature, and we were able to pass a bill in the 2012 legislative session that is referred to as the Georgia Land Bank Act, and Senate Bill 284 for all that are interested in looking that up. And that became effective in July of 2012. So it did a few things. On the surface, land banks are independent. We're tax-exempt authorities, so any property holdings are exempt from taxes, and that includes school taxes. We have independent boards. They are politically appointed boards, but they are independent. And then we do have broad acquisition and disposition authority. So what does the Act provide? So land banks can acquire property like any real estate entity through tax sales. We can have property donated to us. We can do market purchases, negotiated transactions. So we can operate functionally as any other real estate entity. We can enter into contracts. We can borrow money. We can invest. We can do those types of things. And some of these things were brought on with the new Land Bank Act that made these explicitly allowable activities of a land bank. We manage and maintain and hold property. Not all land banks do that. You customize your land bank to fit what you really need. We can extinguish taxes that are delinquent, working with our school boards to provide their consent because the extinguishment includes the school board portion of taxes. Then we can also dispose of property in accordance with our local priorities. So if your community has an interest on gardens or residential, affordable, or mixed income, or what have you, you can customize your disposal process procedures to accommodate that. And we just want to reiterate, no eminent domain. The Land Bank Act also allows us to competitively bid at tax foreclosure sales, and that is a huge benefit. Prior to this, we were not able to do that. So that is going to make us more competitive and functional as we move along with our respective communities and trying to turn certain areas around. And then also we've introduced a tax recapture or self-financing mechanism for land banks, in which land banks can recapture up to 75% of the non-school board portion of taxes for property that it brings it back, property that is brought back online by a land bank. And that basically creates a revenue stream for a land bank that is in line with their activity, which hopefully will lessen the reliance on government funding from your respective city and county going forward. So that kind of just gives you a general flyover of land banks. What are they? Where are they? How did they get started? And what are some of the powers for land banks under the new law? So this section is for Norman, but as I mentioned before at the beginning, Norman's having technical issues, so we're going to go ahead and pinch in and move into this section. So how do you start a land bank? So there has to be a cooperative environment between the city and the county in which a land bank is domiciled. So, and there are multiple ways to do this. So within one county, you have to have at least one city in that county to come together to say we're going to create a land bank authority. With the new law, we actually allow for multiple counties to join together and to create multi-jurisdictional land banks. And you would still have to have at least one city in each county to participate, but you would have multiple cities and counties coming into that land bank. If you have a consolidated government, such as our friend Allison, you can do the consolidated government can create a land bank. And then multiple consolidated governments can also do the same knitting together. And I do want to point out that these do not have to be contiguous counties, so you can actually skip from one county to the next and knit together a regional land bank to accommodate the needs of the community. And so, Allison, feel free if you have anything to say, jump in.
Okay.
And so as you move forward, so that's some of the framework of who's eligible for creating a land bank authority. So once you start creating this land bank, you say, well, how do we govern it? How do we actually move it from just being on paper to something that's functional? So you do have to pass resolutions from your city. If they're separate, your city and your county, or if it's consolidated, the consolidated government has to pass a resolution stating that this is something that you're in support of and that you want. In addition to that, an intergovernmental agreement has to be negotiated and put in place that basically spells out how you're going to function. Then board members need to be appointed, and then bylaws and policies and procedures have to be created. The other question that you must ask yourself as you create this land bank is the why question. Why are you creating the land bank, and what problem do you hope to solve? Is it a focus on residential? Is it a focus on affordable? Is it a focus on commercial? Are you interested in doing an industrial property? Or is this all just to do more green space in your community And you have the ability to do all of those things, but that's a key question to ask as you start it, because it really gets into how you staff and fund yourselves and things of that nature. So as mentioned before, the intergovernmental agreement really outlines the board's responsibilities as well. It really spells out the land bank powers that this respective land bank is going to exercise. And it also talks to how you will dissolve if you were ever to decide that the land bank was no longer needed in your community. Well, how do you unwind this particular entity in your community? And so as far as the entity itself, the new law calls for a member board consisting of 5 to 11 members. It must be an odd number. These are appointed by the city and the county. So the land bank does not appoint its own members. So your respective city council, mayor, county chair, or county commission will be responsible for staffing the board. Now, in terms of how many board members represent each city and each county, that's part of the negotiation between the city and county that will go on and will be documented in your intergovernmental agreement that you will have in place. Elected officials are eligible to serve on the land bank, as well as members of local government. Employees of the government can serve on the land bank authority. Citizens, private citizens can serve on land bank as well. So all those potential persons are eligible to serve. Land bank board members serve without compensation. They are eligible for reimbursement, for expenses for travel or things of that nature, but in terms of a stipend or anything of that nature, they do not receive any type of compensation. And then the majority of the board is needed, just as most boards. A quorum is required for conducting business, and there may be certain stipulations in your intergovernmental that speak to a minimum number of members being represented from a certain geographic area in order to take action on a certain piece of property. Say, for instance, if the city and county determine that for any property dealing with the city, all members of the city contingent must be at the board meeting to vote. Those are the types of things that have to be negotiated and documented in the intergovernmental agreement. And then you also determine how you are going to deal with properties and dispose of those. Also, you can base that on property value, things of that nature as well. So those are the types of things that come into play in terms of governance. And so board membership, some folks often wonder, well, who can these individuals be? And I've alluded to that before, but your tax commissioner can serve on your board. Code enforcement officials can serve on the board. Zoning officials can serve on the board. And elected officials, again, can serve on your board. So you have a lot of latitude with shaping your land bank to reflect the nature of your community and also to represent the needs of your community. And I believe in Allison's case, she actually had the tax commissioner serve on her board. I don't know if that's still the case, Allison. Is that
it's not still the case, but when we were first created, we did have our tax commissioner on the board, and I think it was probably a very good idea, because a lot of times a tax commissioner is not going to understand why you want to forgive delinquent taxes, because they're supposed to collect taxes. And so it was very good to have him on our board, because he was educated early on in what a land bank was and our purpose and what we were doing. Actually became a great supporter and talking with other government officials about why we needed a land bank.
Sure. And in our case, for the first 14 years, we always had at least one county commissioner and one city council person on our board, whereas today we do not have any elected officials. So it evolves to reflect what is the need at the time.
Yeah, we have elected officials. I'm sorry, Chris, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
We also have attorneys. So, a lot of times legal expenses can get expensive and run up really quickly, but if you have an attorney serving on your board that, maybe in real estate or something, then that can be helpful as well.
Correct. And we do have 2 attorneys on our board as well. So that is very helpful. Sometimes you need that free legal advice. So we're kind of walking you through. So how do you start this land bank? How do you staff the board? How do you determine what your focus area is going to be? And then I guess it really gets down to the next step. Well, how do I document all of this? So that was a recurring question that we were receiving. Galba was receiving it. A lot of our partners were receiving it. So we worked with the Center for Community Progress, Habitat out of Valdosta, GMA, ACCG, and Enterprise Community Partners to put together a free manual, which basically we have the link here, and as mentioned before, you will receive this PowerPoint, and so you will see the link, and you'll be able to download that manual for free. And within that manual, it goes through, has a lot of templates. So the intergovernmental agreement, there's a template. The resolutions for your city council or county commission, there are templates for that. There's sample operating and administrative policies in there. There's sample tax extinguishment resolutions and deeds and things of that nature. So there's a lot of information packed into that document, and I think that you will all find it helpful. If you have not already reviewed it, feel free to download it and have that for your review. We have talked with GIC about doing a follow-up presentation at one of your upcoming retreats, and that will allow us to actually spend time walking through the content of those respective documents. And so we did not want to get into that on this presentation, but we acknowledge that there probably needs to be some time spent on that, and so we are committing to doing that at a later time this year. So we do want to provide this with you with that information. So another natural question that comes to mind is, well, how do we fund, a land bank? Typically, you will receive some type of contribution from your city and the county. Since they are the two parties that have come together to create this land bank, they'll typically commit some type of funding to support land bank operations. That could be a general fund allocation. That could be a carve-out of CDBG. In recent programs from the federal government, NSP dollars were actually eligible for use as seed money and operational funding for a land bank. So that is something that now is available. I know that program is wound down, and there may be some residual program income that could still be used for starting your land bank authority as well. There's also the opportunity to, if you receive surplus property, for you to sell property, and that could be used to capitalize your land bank also. Oftentimes you have those type of properties that are sitting around that need to be moved and potentially auctioned, or whatever method you use based on your disposition policy. That's another way. Want to point out also in terms of so the next bullet here you see is staffing. So we talk about city contribution, county contribution. It does not necessarily have to be all cash. They can provide additional contributions. They can provide office space. They can provide the computers that are already part of the inventory for the city or county. They can provide staff. So you can have a staff member employed by the city and the county, or either or, that can actually have shared time with the land bank. It could be a part-time exercise to run the land bank. Land bank does not have to operate every day, 5 days a week. It really depends on the level of activity in your respective community in terms of the staffing that is required. In the case of Atlanta, in the case of Macon, in the case of Augusta, we do have full-time executive directors and support staff, but in some communities throughout the state, there's not a need for that, so they have individuals that wear two hats. They're employed primarily on some projects and functions, but they also are able to become land bank employees as needed for activity for your land bank. So that is something when you start thinking about resources available, look to leverage what you have available to keep your costs at a minimum. You have legal support that comes into play. Do you rely completely on internal legal support from your local city attorney, county attorney's office, or do you bring on external counsel, which of course you have to pay billable hours for, unless you're able to receive pro bono commitments to provide legal support. So that's something else that you have to think about, because this is a real estate activity. So clearly there will be real estate issues, there will be title issues, there will be closings, there will be negotiations, there will undoubtedly be challenges, and you will definitely have a lawsuit or two. So those are all things that you will need to be ready for and staff to respond to accordingly. And lastly, property maintenance is an issue because how do you maintain your property? The expectation is that a land bank will maintain its property in accordance with code, And so you will have to factor that into how do you function and take care of property. Does your public works department do that for your land bank, or do you hire an external professional property management company to do that? So those are things you need to think about in terms of your funding. And the last part is, as we mentioned before, there's a self-financing mechanism built in, but you have to build up a portfolio before that really provides benefit to your land bank. So that will not immediately help you in terms of a funding stream. And Alice, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to that I may have missed.
You're doing a great job.
Okay. So that kind of gives you kind of an overview of funding. And so with that, we'll segue to my friend Allison, and she will talk about this next session. And so Allison, you can say next, and I'll move on to the next slide.
Okay, you can move. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you and talk to you a little bit about land banks today. And Chris has just given you a great overview on what a land bank is and how to create a land bank and some hints on staffing, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. What I'm going to do is talk to you about how we in Macon-Bibb work as a land bank. I've been here 17 years. When I started, I had absolutely no idea what a land bank did, and I went and visited Atlanta, the Atlanta-Fulton County Land Bank, and Chris was not up there at the time, but I spent about 3 days up there and wanted to try and figure out what my job was going to be down here in Macon, and quickly realized my job was not going to be what Atlanta-Fulton County did. Macon-Bibb County is certainly not Atlanta-Fulton County. We don't have a lot of the resources that they have up in Atlanta. We don't have the developers that they have up in Atlanta. So I had some real challenges. And as Chris mentioned earlier, one of the things the Land Bank Authority can do is forgive taxes. And so I went to our tax commissioner. And if you look here, you'll see that there's some differences between a large urban area as well as in a small rural area, especially when you're dealing with land banks and how they're going to operate. So, we had less population density than Atlanta-Fulton, scattered commercial development. And there was a need for us to share some resources. We did not have the same type of resources. So when we created our Land Bank Authority, we had to look at staffing. And when we started, it was just me and an assistant. But we didn't have a lot of funding. When I started, I was going to request funding from the city and the county. I wasn't even sure quite what we did and what I was going to need. So I had to rely a lot on the city and the county. And another huge partner for us was the Macon Housing Authority. So we moved our offices into the Macon Housing Authority, and as a partner with us, they didn't charge us any rent. So we were able to have office space. We were able to have internet through them. We were able to have accounting services through them. So we had to get creative and figure out how can we sustain ourselves if I don't have cash. And so so we got creative, and next, Chris, and created the Land Bank Authority. And my screen just went blank, so hold on a second. Here we go. So we had some unique challenges, and as I mentioned a minute ago, one of the things that the Land Bank can do is forgive taxes. So that's what I was told. We can forgive taxes. So you go out, you acquire a bunch of property, you forgive the taxes on it, you hand it to a developer, and they rebuild. Sounds simple enough, but it took a couple of years to figure out how to do that. Why? Because there are unique challenges for redevelopment. We are working in areas here in Macon because we decided to focus on inner city redevelopment on declining neighborhoods where disinvestment has occurred over decades. We have a great code enforcement system here in Macon-Bibb, but they were overwhelmed and they couldn't keep up. We estimate that we have about 3,000 vacant structures, and that's more than they could handle. In our neighborhoods, and I'm sure in your neighborhoods, you've seen this. There's crime, there's drugs, there's prostitution, or even if it's not there, when we started working in a neighborhood, we had to overcome an image of the crime and drugs that had been there before, even though we were pushing that out of the neighborhood. There's an erosion of the middle class, and here in Macon-Bibb, we had issues with folks moving to other counties. People were moving out of Bibb County to contiguous counties looking for better schools and lower taxes, and so So we saw a preponderance of renters coming in, and we saw a breakdown of our institutions like our school system. Next, Chris. So we're looking at all these vacant properties, trying to figure out where to start, what to do. And you'll see here on the screen there was a study done, the impact of vacant, tax delinquent, and foreclosed property on sales prices of neighboring homes. And this is very important considering all the foreclosures we've had in recent years over the last 5 years. If you look here, you'll see that a vacant and delinquent property can lower property values within 500 feet by 2.1%. If it's vacant and delinquent, that property can lower property values by 2.7. If it's been foreclosed on, but it's not delinquent or vacant, then the property values lower by 3.9%. A foreclosed and vacant or a foreclosed and delinquent property can lower property values by 6.1%. If that property is foreclosed and it's vacant and it's delinquent, then it can lower property values within 500 feet by 9.4%, almost 10%. And we were working in neighborhoods where we had a lot of foreclosures. We had a lot of vacant property, and what we wanted to do is figure out how could we turn a neighborhood around a street at a time. Next. So, one of the problems you have is that it's not always easy to obtain a property. You might identify your properties and know, we want to get rid of that. It's an eyesore as everyone drives into our town, and we need to get rid of it. But sometimes there are some challenges in acquiring that property. It's not as easy as it might seem. Sometimes you just flat can't find the owners. They're absentee owners. They're out of town. They don't respond. Or you can find the owners, but they don't have clear title. So as a land bank, one of our jobs is to try and figure out how to clear that title so that we can acquire the property, especially when we have owners that would like to sell to us. Because our goal is to get that property back into the hands of a redeveloper or to get that property into a public use or something, and we'd like to have a clear title on it. Sometimes you can find owners and they have clear title, but they don't want to sell the property. They're going to leave it to their children down the line who live in California somewhere and probably won't move back here in reality. So, you have your challenges there, and as I said, we wanted to work and kind of do neighborhood redevelopment. That was our emphasis, and that's the beauty of having a land bank is that you can kind of create your land bank according to what your needs are specifically in your community. And so we realized that probably what we needed to do was acquire critical mass and maybe work a street at a time. We also realized very quickly that neighborhood redevelopment would fail when we were able to just get the properties that no one else wants. So in other words, if there are properties on the street and somebody's willing to give that property to the land bank or donate it, but we could only get 2 properties out of 20, it probably was not going to be worth our time because it's going to be very hard to market a piece of property to a developer when everything else is falling down around it. So we decided we would try and acquire everything on the street, or at least the majority of everything on the street. So in the beginning, we learned some hard lessons the hard way. You just take in anything that somebody's willing to give you, and it's here and there and everywhere. You may have a hard time getting that property back on the tax roll and even making a change in the property. Next. So how do land banks acquire property? We have these unique challenges. Well, there are several ways. We acquire property through tax foreclosures, and there is a relatively new judicial interim tax foreclosure, which speeds up the old tax foreclosure process. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but a judicial interim tax foreclosure will allow you to acquire a property within about 5 or 6 months, and when you receive that property, you will have good title that you can get insured, which is huge. The other way we acquire property is through donations. As I said, we're very selective in how we determine whether we're going to accept a donation or not. But we also acquire property just through a hands-link transaction, just purchasing, make an offer, get it appraised, and acquire the property when we have the funds to do so. And we also accept properties directly from our city and county to be transferred out. So once you get that property, how do you dispose of that property? One thing that's very important about a land bank authority is that we have a lot of flexibility in what we can do with the properties, whereas a city or a county does not have that same flexibility. Georgia law requires that there's a public bidding for local government property transfers. So in other words, let's say the city has a piece of property that's been sitting there and a developer shows up and they would like to acquire that property. The city can't just sell that property to the developer. It's required to put it out for a public bid and sell it to the highest bidder. But what a city can do is take that property and transfer it to the land bank authority. And that would be considered a governmental transfer, and it would take out the bidding process, and then the land bank authority, having a greater flexibility in how we transfer properties, can transfer that property to a responsible developer. Next. So, pricing flexibility. A land bank has full discretion in determining the sales price of a property. We can set any sales price on the property that we want to. Now, obviously, I recommend that you're going to have some policies and procedures for determining what that price is going to be for a property. Land banks can sell property, they can trade property, or otherwise dispose of property and rent property on the terms and conditions determined in the sole discretion of the authority at that level. So you're going to make that determination in your community how you're going to dispose of your property and what price you're going to put on that property. You may say you're going to sell your properties for fair market value, and that might be what you want to do. Or you may say we just need to get enough out to cover our cost and maybe a processing fee. What's very, very important is that you're consistent and you're transparent in what you're doing when you're acquiring your properties and when you're disposing of your properties. Because what you don't want to do is be unfair. You don't want to sell one person a piece of property for this worth $10,000. You don't want to sell them that property for $10,000 and then sell somebody else a $10,000 piece of property for $5,000, because that might get you in trouble really quickly. It might look like you were doing a favor to somebody. So you want to be very consistent and transparent and uniform in how you set up your pricing for your properties. Next.
And Allison, one additional thing. When you're going through that process, you also have the flexibility to establish groups that you will or will not engage in business with. So if you have individuals that have been consistently delinquent in taxes or have had severe issues with code enforcement, you can explicitly exclude that class of folks from being eligible to purchase property from a land bank. So there are other things that you can do also on the disposition side that a city or a county cannot do.
Yes, very good point. That's the first thing we look at. If somebody wants to acquire a piece of property from us and they make a request for that property, the first thing we're going to check is what else do they own in our county, and are they paying the taxes on it, and are they a regular in the code enforcement court. So very good point, Chris. Thank you. Land bank priorities for disposition. Land banks may establish priorities for how they're going to dispose of their property. Now, you can do that on your local level. You can just decide what you want to be your priorities when you go to dispose of your properties. And, you know, one of our priorities is to dispose of properties that are tax delinquent, and we want to dispose of those properties to nonprofits for residential redevelopment purposes. And then we also would like to do that with private developers, because we are actually, you know, working more in the residential arena than in other arenas. But you have the total flexibility to decide what you want to focus on and what you want those priorities to be. And that can be put in your intergovernmental agreement. It is actually in the new land bank law. If you don't want to come up with a list, then it's put right there and it's determined for you. But some examples of priorities for land banks around the state is public spaces and places, affordable housing, retail, commercial, and industrial activities, land trusts, or other public entities. So again, land banks are flexible, and you're able to make that decision how you want to create your land bank and what you want to focus on and what you want your priorities to be when it comes to acquiring and disposing of your properties. Next. As Chris said, there may be some folks out there that we don't want to dispose of our property to and allow them to have the property. So we're pretty picky about who we're going to allow to have our property. And so developers can come to the land bank, and it may be a nonprofit developer, it may be a private developer, and they can request conveyance of a property. And they can petition that the land bank forgive those taxes. Now, if we have gone through a lot of effort and expense to acquire a property, maybe it was through negotiations, maybe it was through an interim tax foreclosure, and we have that property and we have a clean title and we're ready to convey it, we want to make sure that that property is going to a responsible developer that is going to put that property back into a productive use, hopefully tax producing, and we want to make sure that they have the capacity to do that. So we're going to ask them to supply us with a few things. We want a developer profile. We want to know, who is this developer? Do they have any experience? What is their capacity? Have they done any redevelopment in the past? Can we go look at some of their projects? We want them to submit to us a proposal and a plan for their project and what they're going to do with the property. We want them to give us a development cost estimate. Do they have any idea what it's going to cost for them to redevelop this property? And if they would like to acquire, say, a house, we work sometimes in the historic district, and we have some homes that would be potentially rehabilitated and sold. And if someone comes and petitions us for that house, and they say they're going to put $5,000 into that house, and then they're going to sell it or rent it out, for us that might not, we might question that, because we might know that it's going to take at least $80,000 to rehabilitate a house in the historic district on that street. So we want to make sure that, they have an idea what they're getting into and what our expectations are going to be. And so we want a realistic cost estimate for the project. We also want to make sure that they have the financial ability to carry out the project. So we're going to want to see something. We may want to see some tax returns. We may want to see a funding commitment from the bank. So we want to make sure that we set everything up to be as successful as possible when we dispose of a property. So we're going to have some requirements that we're going to ask for from the developer. We are also going to ask them how long is it going to take them to redevelop this property based on their proposal. And so we want a timeline. How long is it going to be before you start once you've acquired the property from us? So how long will it be before you finish? What is the ultimate purpose of this property? So next, Chris. So then, once we've ironed all that out and we feel like we have a responsible developer, then we enter a contract of sale and a disposition agreement for the property with the developer. The developer is allowed a certain time before they have to start the project, because they may have some things that they still need to get in order. You have planning and zoning things and that type. And then they have a certain time to complete the proposed redevelopment. What we want to do, though, is we want to make sure, again, that that property is going to be put back into a productive use. So as part of our agreement, we retain the right to re-enter and take that property back if it's not completed, if the redevelopment plan is not completed. If there are unforeseen circumstances, we may allow for an extension on that. But what we don't want to do is spend a lot of time, effort, and money to get a piece of property, put it in a developer's hands, and then it sits and it's never redeveloped. So we're pretty strict on who we're going to dispose our properties to. Okay, next. Property acquisition for affordable neighborhood revitalization. As I mentioned earlier, critical mass is a key to neighborhood revitalization. Going to take more than just one or two houses in a distressed area to do several things. First of all, to attract home buyers and responsible tenants. So our goal is to acquire as many properties as we can up front. I tend to like to be 12 to 18 months ahead of, say, a habitat that wants to go in and acquire some properties to do. We work with Habitat for Humanity here in Macon, and they have adopted a neighborhood that didn't have a very good reputation. It was called the Peach Orchard. And they've rebranded that neighborhood to Linmore Estates, and they made a commitment to go in and do 20 houses. Well, they're close to 40 right now. So we knew that consistently they were going to be in wanting property. So what we did there is we entered a memorandum of understanding rather than an individual agreement for each house. And so they've agreed to stay in the neighborhood. They have done that. They've been there 5 years. And so what we wanted to do is we kind of tested out our critical mass. So we went and bought as many properties on the street as we could, knowing that Habitat was coming behind us. And so what you want to be able to do when you're marketing that property, whether it's us or whether it's Habitat or whether it's a private developer, is when you're trying to sell a house, you want to be able to say, well, yes, we have control of the property next door, and there's going to be a new house going there. So we got the property behind you, and that's the next street that we're going to, and so there'll be a new house going there. So that person has a comfort level in moving into a neighborhood. The next thing we want to do is maybe jumpstart a neighborhood so that we can attract private developers into the area, which we have done in our historic district. We have an area called Bells Hill, and it's a mixture of professors that work at Mercer University, a local college or university here, and then it's also next door it may be somebody that's lived in the neighborhood for 40 years. And so the goal there is we went in and tried to acquire enough property and start some redevelopment through nonprofits so that we would attract private developers into the area, which we have done. And we have stabilized that neighborhood, and we have increased property values by about 30% in that neighborhood. But we did realize, and this is important, this is one of the hard lessons up front, is that neighborhood revitalization will fail if you only take the properties that no one wants. So we targeted as many properties as we could get on the street in order to obtain that critical mass and be able to market, not just to home buyers, but to private developers as well. Next slide. This is part of Bells Hill. So when we go into a neighborhood, we target vacant land to begin with because it's a lot easier to purchase property that is vacant than it is property that is occupied. Depending on your source of funds, it can become very expensive to acquire occupied property. Next. So we looked at all the vacant land and we looked at all the vacant blighted structures. Phase 1 of our project, which was probably 2 or 3 streets, and we bought up everything we could. As I said, I like to be about 12 to 18 months ahead of our developers. Next. Then we start tearing things down. This is, again, where we have partnerships. We have done it many different ways. Sometimes the Land Bank Authority has demolished properties using general funds from the city. Other times our developers are going to demolish the properties. Often there may be funds in a project that we're doing, such as a neighborhood stabilization program project. They may provide some demolition funds. Right now, our Public Works Department with the City of Macon tears down our houses, and it can be very expensive because there's a lot of environmental testing and abatement that takes place with asbestos and lead-based paint. But we just try and figure out how to do it as best we can with in many different circumstances and ways. Next. Then the construction starts, and as you see in the picture, it's critical mass. You see new construction across the street. You see new construction taking place right there in the picture. So we start building in the concentrated areas. Next. And we attract the private developers. If you see right here, this house, this was built by a private developer, and so again, we consider this a success. We are still working in this neighborhood. We've been in this neighborhood for a very long time, using many different funding sources. We have used bond funds, general funds, home funds, CDBG funds, SPLOST funds, you name it, anything we can get. So that's just a couple of ways of how worked in neighborhoods. Next. And that's it. I think that's about good on time.
Yeah, I think we have, looking at my clock here, probably about a good 10 minutes or so, so we do want to allow some time for questions. But this next bullet point here is just really, some of you will encounter this, is how do you go about educating public officials, citizens, and developing those coalitions that want to move forward. And so we learned a lot of lessons when we launched the Land Bank Act that required us having a statewide coalition that actually was able to speak to all of our legislative leaders and gain support. and we actually had almost unanimous support of that act that passed the legislature. And I'm just going to briefly touch on the CAB because I want to go ahead and move into questions. With the CAB Regional, that's one of our newest land banks that was launched. That took us probably a couple of years, just really talking to citizen groups, talking to elected officials, having sessions on Saturday mornings, having people meet with myself, with Allison, others around the state, just understanding land banks and the benefit in order to really bring about that level of support that was needed for that. And you also need to have a strong advocate within your government that will be the lead for that. In that particular case, the head of a community planning and development for the CAB was strongly behind that effort, and that helped to bring that forward. So having said that, I think we will move to questions so we can make sure that everyone gets their questions in. So Corey, we will let you take that over.
Okay, we've received a couple of questions. The first one is, do you have any recommendations on purchase option formats to use and other techniques to limit risk?
We have used options in the past. It does, in terms of the need to outlay the capital, delays that. That is, so speaking of that risk management, that is something we have used effectively in Atlanta, which did in turn actually turn into us being able to acquire the property outright and turn around. It was a foreclosed apartment building that has now been redeveloped into senior affordable housing. But it's been more selective than a main tool. And Alice, I don't know if you have a different experience.
The only time we've used options is when we had projects that we were working on for, say, the Macon Housing Authority, or there's another organization, River Edge, that we work with a great bit. They do a lot of redevelopment, and it's usually large-scale housing. And a lot of times when they are trying to get a grant, say from the Department of Consumer Affairs, Georgia Department of Consumer Affairs, that part of what's required in their application is to have site control. And so what we will do is go out and get options on properties to try and meet their site control requirements, because obviously we don't want to go acquire those properties if they're not going to get the grant. But that's the only time that we've used options.
And that's a good point. In the particular case I mentioned, that was also part of their requirement. They were receiving funds from DCA as well. And so oftentimes you need to have that site control without actually wanting to pursue take the property down. That could be an interim step that you use.
Okay, we have another question. It says, how have you dealt with displacement issues?
Well, as far as we're concerned in Macon, we have bought occupied properties. Usually when we're doing that, we are acquiring properties with federal funds. So we are going to be required to file the Uniform Relocation Act. And so we're going to actually move the tenant or the homeowner out of their house to either a new house or a new rental situation. It costs a lot of money. And, we have an anti-displacement policy. We would prefer not to displace if we don't have to, but there are circumstances when you do have to do that. And we usually follow the Uniform Relocation Act or the Georgia Relocation Act and relocate those folks.
Sure.
We just relocated a family, and it cost about $60,000 to relocate this family.
And on our side, I would say 99% of the time we are dealing with vacant property with no tenant. And I can just recall one instance when we actually had tenants that we ended up relocating. Temporarily, they actually came back to the property once it was rehabilitated. But in most cases, we're pursuing property that has been vacant or abandoned or foreclosed, and we don't have that issue. But that, again, it gets back to what your community, what the goal is, and how you're trying to proceed. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's just you need to have a policy and a plan in place if that is indeed what you're going to do, so you can, have the same level of success that Allison has had in Macon. Plan up front for all those types of things.
Absolutely.
Okay, we have another question. Can taxes be forgiven by donating to a land bank instead of gallowing the property through a tax sale?
Well, the property can be conveyed to a land bank with a tax liability still outstanding. The land bank can then extinguish the taxes, but that property would not go back to that, original party. So that is one way that they can do that. But the board, understand that the board and the school board would make a cooperative decision that that's how they wanted to pursue that. So that is a way when properties, because some of our targeted properties will have delinquent taxes. And if you're willing to donate it, sometimes that is part of the negotiation that, citizen A or owner A will give property to the land bank, and then the land bank will take it from there, including the extinguishment of the taxes.
Another question we have, can SPLOST funds be used to purchase property?
Absolutely, I'm doing it right now. We have a program, local SPLOST, where we're acquiring property for the extension of a road. We have a huge project called our 2nd Street Downtown Corridor, and I'm using SPLOST right now.
How do land banks clear title more quickly and affordably than traditional quiet title action?
Well, that's a good question. So with the judicial tax foreclosure, that will end up, as Allison mentioned, resulting in clear title. Typically, that is insurable, which would not require you to do additional quiet title. If you pursue non-judicial tax foreclosure, oftentimes you will still have to spend time to do quiet title post-auction and post-receipt of that property. So if the land bank can move forward with judicial tax foreclosure, that is typically a little less expensive and gets you quicker to title. That's clear. And Alice, I don't know if you have anything to add to.
Yes, you're right. A judicial interim tax foreclosure is probably going to be the best bet for clearing title on a property if it has other title defects, title defects other than delinquent taxes. But there's no magic bullet. A property does not automatically come into the land bank and become clear and then when it goes out. We have to do the work just like everybody else does. We look at each title and figure out what we have to do.
And that's a great point. I think there's a perception that if your property becomes a land bank property, then it is magically cleared of all liens and defects, impediments, encumbrances. That is not the case. If there are water bills, if there are sanitation liens, if there are taxes, there are other things that are on that property. Just like any other owner, it would have to be dealt with.
I think we may have time for one more. Earlier in the presentation, you all spoke about land bank authorities being able to recapture up to 75% of taxes. Can you speak to that just a little bit more?
Sure. So under the new law, what it allows is that, assuming the city and county that's created the land bank agree, the land bank, if it brings a piece of property back online, let's say you have acquired a tax delinquent or foreclosed property or an abandoned piece of property, and you work together, as Allison kind of outlined, and you have a developer that comes forward and is interested in obtaining that property. Once you convey that property back to that new owner, once it goes to them, it's no longer tax exempt. It's going to start generating taxes. So for the next 5 years, the land bank will receive 75% of those tax proceeds, excluding the school board portion, and that will go directly to fund the operations of the land bank. And it's an up to, so as you read the language, it's an up to 75%. So your city county could decide to have a lower threshold. They could be 50, be 25, but once you establish that threshold, you will receive those dollars for that period of time.
Okay. Well, we've reached 12 o'clock. Again, we want to thank our panelists for participating in this webinar. Also, thank you to our attendees for staying with us and asking these questions.